It was a warm summer night when Officer Brad Matthews and his partner Officer Lisa Reynolds cruised down the quiet streets of the suburban neighborhood the city had grown accustomed to in recent years. The streets seemed almost too peaceful, as if the world was taking a breath after a long day. The hum of the patrol car filled the air, and the soft glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Every now and then Matthews would glance over at his partner, their eyes meeting for a split second before shifting back to the road, his mind already set on the next turn and the next few blocks they would patrol. As they passed the corner of Elm and Maple, something caught Matthew's eye. A black sedan rolled past them. It wasn't speeding or weaving between lanes, but there was something off about it. It was too slow, as if the driver was uncertain or possibly trying to avoid attention. Matthews didn't need much convincing as he signaled for the car to pull over, his hand instinctively moving to the radio to alert dispatch, while his foot gently pressed the brake pedal. As the car slowed, he leaned slightly forward into the wheel, his eyes narrowing as he watched the sedan slow to a stop at the curb. The driver, a man in his mid-40s, stepped out of the car with a slow and deliberate motion. Matthews sized him up immediately: tall, well-built, with a suit that seemed just a little too sharp for a man driving alone at this hour. His shoes gleamed in the low light, and his demeanor was calm, almost too calm. Matthews raised an eyebrow. Was the man hiding something? Was he trying to act too composed to avoid suspicion? Reynolds noticed it, too, the way the man walked with purpose and the way his eyes didn't dart nervously, but held a steady gaze, as if he knew exactly what was going on, like he had seen this scene before more times than she could count. Matthews stepped forward, first his hand resting lightly on his holstered gun. As he looked the man over, he cleared his throat as he began his usual routine. "Evening, sir. Got your license and registration ready?" he asked, his voice flat and uninviting. The man nodded slowly, without hesitation. "Yes, officer," he replied in a calm voice, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve the documents. His response was polite, but there was something in his eyes that made Matthews pause just for a second. It was like a calmness that felt out of place in the usual tension of a traffic stop. Reynolds couldn't help but notice the way Matthews was looking at the man, as if he were trying to figure him out, not just his story, but the very essence of who he was. Matthews watched the man hand him the papers, his mind already racing through possibilities. Was the man a local businessman heading home late from a meeting, or was there something darker beneath the surface? He glanced at Reynolds and then back to the driver. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Yet as he checked the man's details, he had no idea the events about to unfold would forever change how he viewed his job. The man stood calmly next to his car as Matthews looked over his license and registration with growing suspicion. Everything seemed fine on paper, but Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Was the man nervous, or was he just too composed for a routine traffic stop? Matthews stared at him for a moment longer than usual, his mind working overtime, trying to put together pieces of a puzzle he didn't fully understand. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes flicking between Matthews and the man on the side of the road. It wasn't just the man's demeanor that made her uneasy, it was the nagging feeling in her gut that something about this whole situation didn't feel like the normal stops they had done over the years. This was different. There was something about this man that didn't match the story he was giving them. She tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered. "So what's your business out here at this time of night?" Matthews asked, his voice more pointed now, as he glanced at the man's watch and then back up at his face. The question came off harsher than intended, but he couldn't help it. Something about the man's calmness was beginning to feel like a challenge. "Late for a meeting or just out for a late drive?" he added with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The driver didn't flinch or get defensive. Instead, he simply gave a slight nod. "Just headed home, officer. Long day at work." His voice was steady, his eyes locked on Matthews, as though he wasn't fazed by the question or the tone. The response felt rehearsed, too rehearsed, but Matthews couldn't pinpoint why it bothered him so much. "You live around here?" Reynolds piped up from the passenger seat, her voice attempting to sound casual, but laced with suspicion. "Or are you just passing through?" She hadn't meant to sound accusatory, but the man's presence seemed to command a level of authority that made her uneasy. He didn't look like someone just passing through. He looked like someone who belonged somewhere, but she couldn't figure out where. The driver gave a slight shake of his head. "No, just visiting a friend from out of town," he said again, calm and collected, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, something almost imperceptible, but enough to make both officers pause. His answer didn't sit well with them. Something about the way he phrased it made it seem less like a simple trip and more like a well-rehearsed cover story. Matthews didn't want to admit it, but the man was getting under his skin. "Do you mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" Matthews said suddenly, his voice firm, as he gestured toward the man's sedan. The request was routine for situations where an officer felt uneasy, though Matthews had no solid reason. Yet to ask the man to step out, his instincts were telling him to take control of the situation. The man raised an eyebrow, but didn't hesitate. He opened the door and stepped out of the car slowly. As the man stood next to the car, Matthews couldn't help but notice his posture, the way he held himself, like someone who was used to being in charge, someone who expected respect. He was taller than Matthews by a few inches and stood with a quiet authority that didn't seem to match his current situation. It made Matthews uneasy. It was almost as if the man knew something Matthews didn't. "So tell me," Matthews continued, his voice slipping back into its authoritative tone, "what's the real reason you're out here?" The words felt heavy on the air, but the man didn't react the way Matthews expected. He simply met his gaze and smiled, a tight smile that made Matthews feel like the tables were about to turn. The man's calmness only intensified Matthews' unease. The smile he offered was almost knowing, like he was fully aware of how this conversation would unfold. Matthews couldn't help but feel like he was being tested, like the man was holding something back, or worse, waiting for the moment to reveal something Matthews wasn't prepared for. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the interaction unfold like a spectator in a play she didn't want to be part of. "So what's the deal?" Matthews pressed, his voice now slightly more strained. "Why the late-night drive? You sure you're not hiding something?" The driver didn't flinch, maintaining that same unwavering composure that Matthews found more and more infuriating. "I'm not hiding anything, officer," he said calmly, as though the words were more a formality than a defense. "Just a long day. I was on my way home from a meeting. No need to make a mountain out of a molehill." Matthews glanced back at his partner, who was still watching intently from the passenger seat. Reynolds' eyes were narrowed, her brows furrowed in thought. She didn't know why, but something about the man's demeanor didn't sit right with her either. It wasn't just his calmness. There was something deeper, an air of authority, something almost regal about the way he carried himself. It unsettled her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "Right," Matthews said slowly, still scanning the man's face for any sign of nervousness. "A meeting, huh? At this hour? What kind of meeting goes this late?" The man's eyes flickered just briefly, a small shift in his gaze that Matthews caught. For a moment, the officer thought he saw the briefest flicker of irritation behind the man's cool exterior, but it was gone in an instant. "I work long hours," the man replied evenly, his voice smooth. "Sometimes that's just how business works. But it's not important. I'm just trying to get home." Matthews stood there for a moment, still holding the man's license and registration in his hand. He could feel his frustration building, but he didn't know why. There was no reason to be suspicious of the man's words. Everything checked out. Yet something gnawed at him. Something in the man's posture, his responses, his complete lack of fear or agitation. It all felt like a facade, like the man was playing a game, but Matthews couldn't figure out the rules. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. "Do you mind if we check your car?" Matthews asked finally, the words slipping out almost reflexively. His tone had shifted from suspicion to something closer to annoyance. This was getting nowhere, and Matthews felt like he needed to regain control of the situation. He had to know if the man was hiding something, anything. The driver met his gaze without blinking, his calmness unwavering. "Go ahead," he said simply. His response came without hesitation, almost as if he had expected the request. Matthews motioned to Reynolds, who hesitated before stepping out of the patrol car. They moved toward the man's sedan, opening the doors and beginning their search. Matthews tried to ignore the nagging feeling at the back of his mind. This was just a routine search. They'd find nothing, and the man would be free to go. But as they rifled through the car, something inside Matthews told him he was about to learn a lot more than he bargained for. The search of the car was methodical but uneventful. Matthews and Reynolds rifled through the man's sedan, checking the glove compartment, the backseat, and the trunk. There were no drugs, no weapons, no suspicious packages. The car was spotless, nothing out of place. Matthews ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. He had expected to find something, anything, that would justify the growing unease gnawing at him. But nothing. The man had been right all along. He was just another commuter, nothing more. Still, that feeling in Matthews' gut refused to dissipate. Reynolds closed the trunk with a soft click, her face mirroring Matthews' frustration. She had felt the same thing from the beginning. Something wasn't adding up, but now, after the search, it seemed like they had nothing to hold on to. She glanced over at the man, who was still standing by the patrol car, his expression unreadable. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't making any attempt to resist. He was just waiting. Matthews wiped his face, trying to shake off the irritation creeping in. He returned to the man's side, his posture stiff with a mixture of confusion and begrudging respect. "All right, sir, looks like you're clean," he said, his voice colder now, more formal than before. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but we had to check things out." The man nodded, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I understand, officer," he said smoothly, his voice still carrying that underlying authority, like he was in charge of the entire situation. He wasn't angry or even annoyed. It was as if he had expected this. "Could have just told us you were fine from the start," Reynolds muttered under her breath, not meaning for the man to hear, but he caught the words. Without missing a beat, he glanced at her, offering a small, almost knowing smile. "If I had, officer, would you have believed me?" he asked. The question hung in the air for a moment, charged with an unexpected weight. Matthews didn't answer, but the man didn't seem to expect one. Instead, the man shifted slightly, his posture loosening just a touch. "You're doing your job, officer. It's nothing personal." Matthews stood there, staring at him for a long moment. He didn't want to admit it, but something about this man was beginning to get to him. The way he spoke, like he wasn't just an ordinary citizen, was unsettling. His composed nature felt practiced, like someone who had been in control his entire life. Matthews tried to shake the feeling, but the sense that he was dealing with someone who was far more than what he appeared to be continued to linger. "All right," Matthews said, his tone softer now, though still cautious. "You're free to go." He handed the man back his license and registration, his fingers brushing briefly against the man's hand. For the first time during the entire interaction, Matthews felt the tiniest jolt of recognition. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. As the man took his documents, he offered a quiet nod. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate it." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, something that made Matthews feel like he had just missed something important. The man didn't say another word as he turned and got back into his car, the engine roaring to life with a low hum. The patrol car's lights blinked off and the man slowly drove away, disappearing down the empty street. Matthews stood frozen for a moment, still trying to piece together the oddity of the entire encounter. Something was off, but for the life of him, he couldn't figure out what. He looked over at Reynolds, who had her arms crossed and was staring at the man's retreating car with an expression of disbelief. "That was weird," she said, shaking her head. "Yeah," Matthews muttered, his eyes narrowing as he stared down the street. "But something tells me we haven't heard the last of him." Matthews stood there for a moment, still watching the black sedan disappear around the corner, its taillights glowing briefly before vanishing into the night. The sound of the engine faded, and a strange silence fell over the street. The patrol car hummed softly, its engine running, but Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just slipped through his fingers. His mind raced, replaying every detail of the encounter. The man's calmness, his composed responses, the way he carried himself, it was all too much. Too perfect. Reynolds finally broke the silence, her voice laced with uncertainty. "What just happened? What the hell was that?" Matthews turned to her, his brow furrowed. I don't know, Lisa, but something's not right. Yeah, I felt it too, she said, her voice quieter now. It was like he was just waiting for us to do all of this. Like he knew what we were going to ask before we even said it. She shook her head, clearly frustrated. But why? Who was he? Matthews glanced back down the street, still thinking. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. I've got a bad feeling about this. His mind was already spinning with possibilities. Could the man be some kind of criminal mastermind? Someone hiding in plain sight? Or was it something else entirely? But why had he been so calm? So in control? Maybe we should just let it go. Brad, Reynolds suggested, though there was a hesitation in her voice. I mean, we searched the car. His story checked out. It's not like we got anything on him. Matthews didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a long, slow breath. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him to dig deeper. There was something off about that man, something that went beyond just a routine traffic stop. I'm not letting this go, Matthews said firmly. Something about him feels too familiar. Reynolds gave him a skeptical look. Familiar? What do you mean? Matthews didn't answer immediately. His gaze was still fixed on the now empty street, but his mind was flashing back to a story he had heard just a few days ago. It was something that had slipped his mind in the heat of the moment, but now it was coming back to him. The man had said he was headed home from a meeting. That could have been a cover, but Matthews couldn't shake the memory of a conversation he had overheard in the break room. They had been talking about changes in the police department, big changes. A new incoming police chief, a man named Kenneth Turner. Matthews' heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The man from the car, the one who had been so composed, so unflappable, was Kenneth Turner, the incoming state police chief. Matthews' stomach dropped. The same Turner who had been making waves in the media for his outspoken views on police reform. The same Turner who was about to take charge of the entire state police force. Oh my God, Reynolds muttered, her voice suddenly filled with understanding. That was him, wasn't it? Matthews turned toward her, his mind reeling. It has to be. He felt a wave of shock and disbelief wash over him. They had just mocked and harassed one of the most powerful men in the state, a man who was about to leave the entire police force. It was the kind of mistake that could ruin careers. Matthew's heart raced. What had started as a routine traffic stop had now turned into a nightmare. They hadn't just pulled over any driver. They had crossed paths with someone who could change the entire direction of their careers, and they had treated him like any other suspect on the street. Well, it's too late now, Reynolds said, her voice heavy with regret. What do we do? Matthews stared at the ground for a moment, his mind working in overdrive. There was no way to undo what had happened. The encounter had already occurred, but there was still time to make things right. We need to apologize, Matthews said, his voice low and serious. And we need to do it fast. Matthews and Reynolds sat in the patrol car in stunned silence. The weight of their mistake hung over them, thick and suffocating. They had just treated one of the most powerful men in the state like a common suspect, and now the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Turner wasn't just anyone. He was the incoming state police chief, a figure who would soon command every officer in the department. The magnitude of what they had done was enough to make Matthew's stomach churn. Do you think he knows we messed up? Reynolds asked quietly, her hands gripping the seat as if she could somehow anchor herself to reality. I mean, there's no way he didn't notice the way we treated him. I'm sure he knows, Matthews replied grimly. He wasn't stupid, but he didn't say anything. He just let it go, which makes this worse in a way. He didn't even raise his voice or get angry. He just smiled like he knew exactly what we were doing. Reynolds let out a frustrated sigh, running her hands through her hair. That's what scares me. The way he was so calm, like he already had the upper hand. She looked at Matthews, her face tight with worry. Do you think he's going to do something about this? Matthews leaned forward in his seat, his hands on the steering wheel, eyes narrowing. I don't know. He's too smart to make a scene, but I'm sure he's not happy about it. We just made ourselves a target. His voice was tight with regret, but there was also a growing sense of urgency. We need to fix this. Now. Reynolds nodded, her gaze distant as she processed the situation. So what do we do? We can't just go up to him and apologize. I mean, how do you even begin to fix something like this? Matthew's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. The last thing he wanted was to have this blow up in their faces. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that people like Turner didn't forget slights, especially not ones as public as this. They would face the consequences sooner or later. But the real question was, how soon? First things first, Matthews said, determination setting in his voice. We need to talk to our captain. We need to come clean about everything. We can't cover this up. If Turner decides to make a move, the last thing we want is for our captain to hear about this from someone else. Reynolds looked at him skeptically. You really think that's a good idea? Talking to the captain about this. I mean, if we go to him now, it's going to look like we're already admitting guilt. What if it makes it worse? Matthews shook his head, his expression resolute. We don't have a choice. We need to be transparent. If we don't come forward now, it's going to look like we're hiding something. Trust me, we don't want to add fuel to this fire. Reynolds exhaled deeply, still unsure, but knowing that Matthews was right. The longer they waited, the more it would look like they were trying to cover their tracks. All right, I get it, but what do we say? Hey, sorry we treated you like dirt, by the way. We didn't know you were the incoming chief. How do you even begin to apologize for that? I'm not sure, Matthews admitted, his brow furrowed in thought. But we'll figure it out. The key is owning up to it. No excuses. Reynolds nodded, her face grim. She wasn't sure if an apology would be enough, but it was all they had at this point. They had made a huge mistake, and now they had to face the consequences. Let's just hope he's as forgiving as we hope he is. Matthews stared out the windshield, lost in thought. The thought of facing Turner, knowing who he really was now, sent a ripple of anxiety through his chest. But one thing was certain. Whatever came next, Matthews and Reynolds had to be ready for it. They couldn't hide from their mistakes. They had to own them and hope that somehow they would be given a chance to make things right. The drive back to the station was silent, each officer lost in their own thoughts. Matthews' mind was racing, trying to anticipate what would happen next. He had seen the rise and fall of officers' careers before, but this situation felt different, more personal. Kenneth Turner wasn't just a figurehead about to take charge of the state police. He was someone who had the power to tear apart their careers with a single word. And the worst part was, Matthews knew deep down that they had no one to blame but themselves. Reynolds glanced at Matthews, her face still tight with worry. Do you think he'll report us? She asked softly, breaking the silence. I mean, what if he decides to turn this into a whole thing? Matthews clenched his jaw, staring at the road ahead. He could. He's got that kind of power. But what worries me more is what he might do behind the scenes, you know. He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. If Turner wants to make an example of us, he doesn't need to make a scene. He could just make us disappear. Reynolds swallowed hard, her thoughts swirling. So what do we do? Just sit here and wait for the axe to fall? Or do we try to do something about it before it gets worse? Matthew's eyes flicked toward her for a moment. We fix it, he said firmly. We don't wait for him to come after us. We go to him first. She blinked, surprised. You mean go to him and apologize again, face to face? Exactly, Matthews replied, his voice steady. The least we can do is show that we're willing to take responsibility. Maybe he'll respect that. Maybe he won't. But we can't let him think we're hiding or running from this. Reynolds was silent for a moment, processing his words. Matthews had a point. Taking ownership of their actions was the only option left. All right, so we go to him. But what if he decides to make an example of us anyway? What if he throws the book at us? I'll deal with that if it happens, Matthews said, his voice hardening with resolve. But right now, the best thing we can do is face him head-on, show that we're not trying to sweep this under the rug. If we run from it, we've already lost. As the patrol car rolled into the station parking lot, Matthews pulled into a space and turned off the engine. He felt the weight of the upcoming confrontation pressing down on him, but he also knew they had no choice. They couldn't keep avoiding the reality of the situation. The longer they waited, the worse it would get. "Let's do this," Matthews said quietly, meeting Reynolds' eyes. "We go to him, and we make it right. No more running. No more hiding." Reynolds nodded, her face tight with resolve. She wasn't sure how Turner would react, but she knew this was the only chance they had to salvage something from this mess. "Let's hope it's enough." The two officers stepped out of the patrol car and walked toward the entrance of the station. As they crossed the threshold, the air inside felt cooler, almost sterile, as if the weight of the situation had followed them into the building. They walked past a few other officers who didn't pay them much attention. Most were too caught up in their own business to notice the tension in the air. When they reached the captain's office, Matthews knocked once, a firm, controlled sound. They could hear movement from inside before the captain's voice called out, "Come in." Matthews turned the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. They stepped into the captain's office where Captain Reynolds, a different Reynolds, sat behind his desk, papers scattered across it. His eyes flicked up when they entered, and the look he gave them told Matthews they weren't going to be greeted with a warm welcome. "We need to talk," Matthews said, his voice steady but serious, "about something we did tonight." Captain Reynolds looked up at the two officers as they stepped into his office, the air between them thick with tension. Matthews noticed the way the captain's eyes narrowed ever so slightly as they entered, the unspoken weight of the situation clear. There was no mistaking it. Captain Reynolds already knew something was off. Matthews had hoped he might have had a few minutes to explain the situation before the storm hit, but it seemed that the captain was ready for whatever they had to say. "Close the door," Captain Reynolds said with a soft but firm tone. Matthews did as instructed, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing through the room. He stood still for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. The weight of what had happened felt heavier than ever now. They weren't just about to confess a mistake. They were about to face the consequences of a moment that could ruin their careers. "We made a mistake," Matthews said finally, his voice steady but laden with regret. "A big one." Captain Reynolds raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for Matthews to continue. "We pulled over a man tonight," Matthews went on, glancing at Reynolds before meeting the captain's gaze. "We treated him like he was just another suspect. But he's not just anyone." He paused, taking a deep breath. "That man was Kenneth Turner, the incoming state police chief." The words hung in the air, heavy and thick. Captain Reynolds' eyes widened, and Matthews immediately saw the shift in his expression. The captain leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the edge of the desk as he processed what Matthews had just revealed. For a long moment, the room was dead silent. "Turner?" Captain Reynolds finally muttered, his voice low, as if he was still trying to wrap his mind around the news. "You two stopped Kenneth Turner *." Matthews nodded grimly. "Yes, sir. We didn't know who he was at first. We were suspicious and we went through his car. He wasn't aggressive, but we treated him like he was just another random driver. He didn't say a word about who he was until the end, and by then it was too late. We'd already crossed the line." The captain let out a long, frustrated sigh, rubbing his forehead as if trying to stave off the headache Matthews knew he had just created. He could see the captain's thoughts shifting, whether it was about their judgment, the career-threatening consequences, or Turner's inevitable reaction. It was hard to tell. "You two have no idea what you've just done, do you?" Captain Reynolds said finally, his tone sharp and edged with disbelief. "We know, sir," Reynolds responded quietly. "We're not trying to cover it up. We came here to tell you the truth. We messed up." The captain stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked around the desk, his steps deliberate. Matthews braced himself, expecting an outburst or some form of anger. But what came next surprised him. The captain stopped in front of them, his face hard but not angry, just resigned. "I can't believe you did that," the captain muttered, shaking his head. "But I appreciate the honesty, and I'm glad you came to me first instead of letting this fester. But this is bigger than just a mistake on a routine stop. Do you have any idea what this could mean?" Matthews felt a knot form in his stomach. "We were hoping you'd tell us what happens next, sir. We just..." Didn't think. We never should have treated him that way. The captain sighed heavily again, his gaze flicking between Matthews and Reynolds. I'm going to have to report this, he said flatly. The department's going to need to know what happened. You both know how that goes, but you've done the right thing by coming to me first. If you want to fix this, it starts with taking full responsibility. There's no other way. Matthews nodded, his throat tightening as the reality of what this meant began to sink in. They were already in too deep, and no matter what happened next, their careers were on the line. But there was one thing Matthews was certain of. They had done the right thing by owning up to their mistake. We understand, sir, Matthews said. We'll take whatever comes next, but we just want to make it right. The captain gave a long, measuring look at both officers before finally nodding. I'll see what I can do. But be prepared. This isn't going to go away anytime soon. Matthews and Reynolds exchanged a glance, their faces set with determination. They didn't know what the fallout would look like, but they had made the first step in facing the consequences of their actions. They could only hope that somehow Turner would show them the same understanding that they had tried to show him. And in that uncertain moment, Matthews realized that, for better or worse, their lives had just changed forever.